Life is a battlefield. Have you ever felt like you were constantly under attack? Maybe you've been betrayed by someone you trusted. Maybe you've been falsely accused or unfairly judged. Perhaps you're fighting battles no one else can see, temptations, doubts, fears. Joseph understood this struggle. His life was marked by pain, rejection, and hardship. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused by his master's wife, and left to rot in a prison for a crime he didn't commit. Yet, despite all this, he remained strong. The Bible describes Joseph's struggles with powerful imagery. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him, but his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. Picture this scene. A warrior stands in the midst of battle. Arrows fly toward him from every direction. The enemy is relentless, attacking with everything they have. And yet this warrior does not fall. His bow remains steady, his arms unshaken. Why? Because his strength does not come from himself, it comes from God. Joseph was that warrior. Though he was wounded by betrayal, wounded by lies, wounded by suffering, he never let go of his faith. He could have given in to despair. He could have become bitter. He could have abandoned God, but instead he stood firm. He trusted that God was still in control. Now ask yourself, how do you respond when life attacks you? Do you let the wounds define you? Do you let bitterness take root? Or do you hold on to faith, believing that God is still working behind the scenes? Joseph's story is a message of hope. It tells us that pain is not the end of the story. Every arrow that wounded him was ultimately used to shape his destiny. Your struggles, too, have a purpose. The very thing meant to destroy you might be the thing God uses to elevate you. Envy is one of the most dangerous forces in the world. It is silent, invisible at first, but once it takes root in a heart, it can destroy relationships, families, and even lives. Joseph was no stranger to envy. He was a victim of it from a young age. His father, Jacob, loved him more than his brothers. It was not Joseph's fault, yet this special favor stirred bitterness in their hearts. Jacob even gave him a coat of many colors, a symbol of honor and distinction. Instead of celebrating their brother's blessing, Joseph's brothers allowed jealousy to consume them. The turning point came when Joseph shared his dreams. He told them about a vision where they would one day bow before him. Instead of seeking to understand, his brothers reacted with rage. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Let's kill him and throw him into a pit and say that a wild animal devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." Their words reveal the nature of envy. It does not just desire what another person has, it seeks to destroy the person who has it. Envy turns admiration into resentment, love into hatred. Have you ever experienced this? Maybe you've been envied by others, criticized, rejected, or sabotaged for no reason other than your success or favor. Or maybe, if you're honest, you have struggled with envy yourself, wishing that someone else's blessings belonged to you. Envy is a poison that never satisfies. The brothers thought that if they got rid of Joseph, their anger would disappear. But it didn't. They carried guilt and shame for years. Meanwhile, Joseph, the one they tried to destroy, was being prepared by God for something greater. If you have been hurt by envy, take heart. God is your defender. No one can take away what He has planned for you. And if you have felt envy towards someone else, do not let it take root. Celebrate others' blessings, knowing that God has a plan for you too. Joseph's story reminds us that no attack of jealousy can stop the plans of God. Not every attack in life comes from an enemy you can see. Some come in the form of whispers, in secret moments when no one is watching. Temptation is one of the most dangerous arrows the enemy uses because it does not force its way in. It invites. It disguises itself as opportunity, pleasure, or an easy escape. Joseph faced this kind of attack in a way few could resist. After being sold into slavery, he found favor in the house of Potiphar, a high-ranking official in Egypt. He was given great responsibility, and everything he touched prospered. But with great success came great danger. Potiphar's wife began to notice Joseph. Day after day, she tried to seduce him, inviting him into sin. She was persistent. She used power, charm, and secrecy to try and lure him into doing what was wrong. But Joseph stood firm. He did not entertain her. He did not linger. He did not try to justify it. Instead, he responded with a simple but powerful question. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph understood something that many fail to see. Temptation is never just about the moment. It is about your relationship with God. Temptation always makes sin look harmless. It tells you that no one will know, that it will not matter, that just once will not hurt. But Joseph saw the truth. Sin is never isolated. It always has consequences, and more importantly, it always affects your walk with God. So Joseph did something remarkable. He ran. He did not negotiate. He did not try to prove his strength. He fled from temptation, leaving even his garment behind. This is a lesson for all of us. When temptation comes, the best response is not to argue with it. It is to flee. In today's world, temptation is everywhere, on our screens, in our workplaces, in our thoughts. It does not always look evil. Sometimes it looks like an opportunity, but no opportunity is worth losing your integrity. Joseph may have lost his position in Potiphar's house because of his decision, but he gained something far greater, God's favor. When you choose obedience over compromise, you may lose something in the moment, but you gain something eternal. Sometimes doing the right thing does not lead to immediate reward. In fact, it can bring suffering. Joseph chose righteousness over sin. He refused temptation, honored his master, and remained faithful to God. And yet, instead of being rewarded, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. Potiphar's wife, humiliated by Joseph's rejection, turned her desire into vengeance. She took his garment, twisted the story, and presented him as a criminal. Her words carried weight, and without a trial, Joseph was cast into the darkness of a dungeon. Imagine his thoughts. He had already been betrayed by his brothers. Now he was accused of something he never did. He had no voice, no defense, no one to plead his case. His reputation was ruined, his freedom taken, his future uncertain. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever been misunderstood, slandered, or judged unfairly? False accusations hurt deeply because they attack not just our actions but our character. They leave us feeling powerless. Injustice shakes our faith, making us question, where is God? Why is this happening? But Joseph did something extraordinary. He did not allow bitterness to take root. Many people, when falsely accused, respond in two ways. They fight back with anger, seeking revenge. They fall into despair, allowing the lies to define them. Joseph did neither. He chose to trust God's justice over man's judgment. Though the world saw him as a criminal, God still saw him as chosen. Though the prison was his reality, his destiny was still in God's hands. False accusations are one of the enemy's greatest weapons. He used them against Joseph. He used them against Jesus. He will use them against you. But the truth always comes to light. The lies spoken about you today will not define your future. No false accusation can cancel the plans of God. You may feel trapped in a prison of misunderstanding, but remember, prisons do not limit God. If he was with Joseph in the dungeon, he is with you in your trial. Hold on, God is your defender. What gave Joseph the ability to endure such trials? How did he keep his faith when life continued to attack him? The answer lies in one simple truth: his strength was not his own. The Bible tells us, his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. Joseph was not strong because of his own willpower. He was strong because God held him. When life attacks you, when betrayal wounds you, when accusations break your spirit, where do you turn? Many people rely on their own strength. They fight back in anger, they try to prove themselves, they strive to control their situation. But Joseph shows us another way, the way of trust. He did not waste energy defending himself. He did not allow himself to become bitter. Instead, he entrusted himself to God. He believed that even when life was unfair, God was still in control. This is the secret to endurance. Strength does not come from striving but from surrender. Joseph's story reminds us that God does not always remove the trials immediately, but he strengthens us to endure them. When Joseph was thrown into the pit, God was with him. When he was sold as a slave, God was with him. When he was in prison, God was still with him. The presence of trials does not mean the absence of God. In fact, it is in the trials that we see his strength the most. Have you been trying to hold everything together on your own? Have you been carrying burdens too heavy for you? The hands that held Joseph are the same hands that hold you today. You do not have to fight alone. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Joseph's bow remained steady, not because he was a warrior, but because God was his strength. Let go of fear, let go of striving, let go of trying to control everything. Place your strength in God's hands. The story of Joseph is one of the greatest examples of how God can turn suffering into glory. He was betrayed, sold as a slave, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. But his story did not end in the pit or the dungeon. After years of being forgotten in prison, something happened. Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, had a dream that troubled him deeply. None of his wise men or advisors could interpret it. That's when someone remembered Joseph. Joseph had already interpreted dreams for fellow prisoners, and his gift was undeniable. He was summoned before Pharaoh, and with God's wisdom, he revealed the meaning of the dream. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of famine. But he didn't just give the interpretation. He also gave the solution. Joseph advised Pharaoh to store up food during the years of abundance so that the nation would survive the famine. Pharaoh was so impressed by his wisdom that he immediately promoted him to the highest position in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Imagine this: one moment Joseph was a prisoner, the next he was the most powerful man in the land. What does this tell us? God's plan never fails. The very things that seemed to destroy Joseph were actually leading him to his destiny. If his brothers had never sold him, he wouldn't have gone to Egypt. If he had never been falsely accused, he wouldn't have met the people in prison who connected him to Pharaoh. If he had never been in prison, he wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time to interpret Pharaoh's dream. What the enemy meant for evil, God used for good. Have you ever gone through something so painful that you couldn't see how anything good could come from it? Joseph's story reminds us that nothing is wasted in God's hands. You may feel forgotten. You may feel like everything is working against you. But just like Joseph, your story is not over. God is always working, even when you don't see it. Joseph's story is not just about personal triumph. It is a foreshadowing of something much greater. His life reflects the life of Jesus in remarkable ways. Think about the similarities. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers and sold for silver. Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples for silver. Joseph was falsely accused and punished for a crime he didn't commit. Jesus was falsely accused and sentenced to death despite his innocence. Joseph was thrown into a pit, but later raised to a position of power. Jesus was buried in a tomb but resurrected in glory. Joseph became the savior of many through his wisdom and leadership. Jesus became the savior of the world through his sacrifice and resurrection. Joseph's journey teaches us that suffering is never the end of the story. The enemy may try to destroy God's people, but God always has a greater plan. When Joseph was lifted up to power, he had the opportunity for revenge. He could have used his authority to punish his brothers, but instead, he chose grace. When they finally stood before him, desperate for food, they did not recognize him. They feared for their lives when they realized who he was. But Joseph, with tears in his eyes, told them, "Do not be afraid. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to save many people alive. Isn't that the message of Jesus? The cross was meant for evil, yet God used it for the salvation of the world. Have you ever felt betrayed, rejected, or unfairly treated? Joseph's story and Jesus' sacrifice both remind us of this truth. God's grace is greater than any betrayal. If Joseph could forgive those who sold him into slavery, and if Jesus could forgive those who crucified him, then we too are called to forgive. This is the beauty of God's plan. He takes what was meant for harm and turns it into redemption. Joseph's story is powerful because it is not just about him, it is about you. His life shows us how God works, not only in the lives of great biblical figures but in our everyday struggles. Think about what Joseph endured. He was betrayed by his own family. He was thrown into a pit and abandoned. He was sold into slavery, losing everything he knew. He was falsely accused and imprisoned. He was forgotten, left to suffer in a dark place. Maybe you have faced betrayal from people you trusted. Maybe you feel like you've been thrown into a pit of despair with no way out. Maybe you've lost something or someone precious to you. Or maybe, like Joseph in prison, you feel forgotten, like God has left you in a place of suffering with no end in sight. But Joseph's story did not end in pain, and neither will yours. God was working in every part of Joseph's life, even when it looked like everything was against him. The pit, the prison, the false accusations, they were all part of the plan. And the same is true for you. The pain you're facing today is not the end of your story. The things meant to break you are the very things God will use to lift you up. The trials you are enduring now will one day become your testimony. The hardest thing to do in the middle of suffering is trust. When life is painful, it's easy to believe that God has abandoned you, but Joseph's life proves otherwise. Even when we can't see it, God is moving behind the scenes. Joseph spent years suffering before he saw God's plan unfold, but in the end, he could look back and say, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." You may not see it now, but one day you will say the same. God is not done with your story. Joseph's story teaches us a final, powerful lesson: trust in every season. It is easy to trust God when things are going well, when prayers are answered, when blessings overflow, when life feels secure. But what about the seasons of hardship, the times of betrayal, loss, injustice, and suffering? Joseph's life was filled with seasons of pain before he saw victory. He had a season of favor as his father's beloved son. He had a season of betrayal when his own brothers sold him. He had a season of servanthood as a slave in Potiphar's house. He had a season of temptation, faced with sin and testing. He had a season of false accusations, punished for something he didn't do. He had a season of waiting, forgotten in a prison cell. He had a season of victory when God elevated him to power. Through every single season, Joseph remained faithful, and because of that, God remained faithful to him. What season are you in right now? Are you in a season of pain, wondering why God is allowing hardship? Are you in a season of waiting, feeling like nothing is changing? Are you in a season of temptation, struggling to make the right choice? Are you in a season of betrayal, feeling abandoned by those you trusted? Wherever you are, God is with you. The same God who brought Joseph from the pit to the palace is the same God working in your life today. The same God who turned betrayal into blessing, prison into purpose, and suffering into salvation is still in control. Joseph's story ended in redemption, forgiveness, and fulfillment, and yours will too. You may not understand why things are happening right now, but one day you will see the full picture. You will look back at the hardest seasons of your life and realize, what was meant for evil, God meant for good. Hold on, trust in every season. Your story is still being written, and when God is the author, the ending is always glorious.